This El Paso History TV program is underwritten in part by the Hunt Family Foundation, an El Paso charitable trust that supports our local community.
So this is just kind of a generic explanation as to how tax credit programs work. So in general, you need to propose a project that meets whatever requirements exist for a given tax credit program. The reason that people like us exist is that most developers, for whatever reason, either they don't have sufficient tax liability, or there are some rules around what kinds of entities and individuals especially can use historic tax credits specifically. And so even if you have sufficient tax liability, you may not be able to use the credit just because the way the code is written. And so we'll bring in investors that can buy those credits. It may not be, if it's a federal tax credit, they're not buying the credits, they're actually investing in your project and becoming a partner that has real risk and reward potential. If it's the state credits, they actually just buy them generally. And so, the amount of the credits is based on whatever agency administers the credit, the actual cost of the project, depending on the credit, and the percentage. So again, the state credit is 25%. And then, all these things depend on the program, so that'll make more sense as I go through this. So in terms of your net benefit, this I use $10 million as the total cost of a project as a really for easy math, and I know some projects may be smaller than that, and we'll go into what that means here in a bit. But assuming you have a $10 million project, you can expect about 15% of that in terms of net benefit from federal credits. From the Texas credit, you can expect roughly 22%, so $2.2 million from a $10 million deal. If you're able to get new market equity, new market allocation, you can expect about 15% of the amount of allocation you get. And so assuming you're able to access all three of these programs, it'll cover more than 50%. And these are generally conservative, at least for a project of this size. Hopefully it'll be more than that. But these should be pretty, good estimates in terms of your floor. When projects get smaller, generally the net benefit goes down because the transaction costs of putting together the necessary legal structure to access these programs are kind of the same, whether it's a $5 million project or a $50 million project, or a $500,000 project. And so, at a point, your benefit gets eaten up by those costs as you get lower and lower in terms of project costs. And there are some ways to mitigate that effect, but it does have an effect nonetheless. So the federal credits and the state credits are based on what's called Qualified Rehabilitation Expenditures, QRE. And so generally, QRE you can think of, if you were to renovate a building and turn it over, anything that doesn't fall out qualifies. And that's obviously a rough explanation, but things that don't qualify are site work, acquisition cost does not count, additions do not count, and any FF&E. So, this podium would not count, but something like a screen that's built in, that may count. And so there's some nuance to that rule, that developers should pay attention to, because you can miss out on credits, on QRE that you should be getting, and you may not. So a test you have to meet is called substantial rehab, which bottom line, that really just means you have to spend more than the value of the building. They just want to make sure you're not incrementally spending over years and years and years and getting credits on it. I think that was the intent of this rule. The technical explanation is that you have to spend more than the adjusted basis, which is, let's say you bought the building for $1 million, you've put $100,000 in it, it's depreciated $200,000, that means you have to spend more than $900,000 to be able to access credits. And that's at the start of your project. It also has to be placed in service, which the practical definition of that is that it's ready for its intended use, whatever that use may be. So I thought it was important to put this last point, that when you place the building in service, which is generally the threshold the industry uses, is when you get your CO, your certificate of occupancy. When that happens, that's the year that dictates the credit, or the year that the credit is available. And so you can use both the federal and the state credit all in 1 year. So if you get $1 million, or let's just use the $10 million example, if you get, in that example, that would be a $2 million federal credit because it's 20%. The investor or the developer, if they can use that entire credit in a single year. Same thing with the Texas credit, which is among the reasons it's the best in the country. Some, like North Carolina, has a program where you have to use it over, I think they just changed it to 3 years. So that, because of time value of money, that kind of mitigates the benefit a bit. So that's among the reasons that Texas has a great program. So there's 2 federal programs. There's a 20%, which generally when you hear people talking about federal historic tax credits, this is what they're talking about, is the 20%. And so again, if you spend $10 million of QRE, that is, you'll generate a credit of $2 million. It has to be a certified historic building, which that means it's on the National Register. There's 2 ways to be on the register, either individually listed or in a historic district. Counterintuitively, being on the register does not inhibit your ability to do whatever you want to with the building. You can actually demolish a building that's on the National Register, and naturally you wouldn't think that, but you can. And so it's really just enables access to incentives rather than being a stick. So that's a nice little piece of the federal historic credit. It has to be a certified rehabilitation, which means that your design and your construction has to comply with historic standards. I'll go into the details of what that means here in a second. But there's a 3-part application process. So there's a part 1, part 2, and 3. Part 1 shows the building is of historic significance, so it needs to be on the register. Part 2 shows that what you've designed complies with historic standards. Generally, people submit that maybe as early as 25% construction documents, but usually it's 50 or so construction documents. So you do need to be a good bit into your design to be able to submit. And then your part 3 shows that what you actually built complies with historic standards. So this last point, we actually get involved in a lot of projects after the fact, and this is especially true with tax exempt groups that may not think that they can use credits. And so, we'll talk to them and kind of let them know that, hey, you're probably complying with historic tax credits based on what you're designing, because most nonprofits are generally sensitive to the historic integrity of the building, and so they may as well pursue a program of which they're meeting the intent. So it's there are restrictions, obviously, but generally, in my experience, they have been less restrictive than developers often assume. So there's 10 points to the Secretary of Standards. I know this is pretty wordy, but I thought it was important to put on here, at least for people's reference after the fact. I'll go through them quick as I can. So you have to change the defining historic characteristics or qualities of the building minimally, if at all. Some of these are kind of repetitive. The historic character needs to be retained. This third point is important because when you get a building on the National Register, there is a period of significance that is listed, and so you have to be cognizant. Your architect, especially, and your contractor have to be cognizant of that period, because that's really what you're complying with. So, a building may be built 1890, and so obviously in 1920 it was historic, but if something happened in 1920 that was not what was the case in 1890, then you need to be cognizant of that and build to what happened in 1890, assuming that's the period of significance. So anyways, I just bring that up because that's an important thing to be cognizant of, because it dictates what you can do and what you can't do with the building. You know, if there are additions that are historic in themselves, which generally the definition of historic is more than 50 years, that's not always true. Some things that are older than 50 years are not considered historic by the Park Service, but if there's an addition that's more than 50 years but was built after the building was built, the original building, you also need to be cognizant of that. You know, distinctive features shall be preserved. Again, these are kind of repetitive. In general, you need to repair rather than replace. You shouldn't damage the historic materials. Archaeological resources, this is a pretty rare thing to happen. I think I've dealt with one project. I think our firm has dealt with one project where this was relevant, and it was in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where there was a Civil War battle. So that was significant, you know, archaeological stuff. So they had to dig, and they had to submit a couple additional or ancillary applications to the Park Service, and ultimately it got approved, but they had to be aware of what they were going to do to the site, which fortunately for this project, they weren't going to really do anything. So it was a museum, and they integrated what they found into the museum. So it was kind of a neat little addition. So this next part is important to be aware of. If you're going to build an addition, it needs to be distinct from the historic integrity of the old building. So like Lane Gaddy did on the Martin building, you know, he's got the annex right next to it, and it's obviously not historic, and that's what they want. You know, they don't want you building a fake historic addition. They want it to be distinct and the original building to be obvious. So something to be aware of. So this is just kind of the practical effect of the standards. Again, you know, the period of significance, it should be tailored to that when possible, restore rather than replace. Windows are probably, you know, we cold call a lot of projects that we think may comply. This is probably the biggest, you know, the thing that knocks most projects out is the windows, because they don't want to, you know, either sometimes you will have to retain the old windows, oftentimes you won't, but when you do replace the windows, you need to make them look like the old ones. And so some developers just are unwilling to comply with that, and if you don't need to, you know, I mean, if you can afford not doing it, then that's fine, but you know, oftentimes we'll see developers that end up caving and using the window that is approved by the Park Service so they can use credits. So building circulation, you know, hallways, common space, that's real important. You know, like if you're doing a theater, obviously the seating space is really important. You know, so those are, and like a gym. And if you have a building that has multiple common spaces, so if you have maybe a gym and a auditorium, like an old school, we've seen that the Park Service is flexible. So they may be willing to let you cut the auditorium, for example, or cut the gym. That's probably better. Cut the gym into apartments. In fact, we've done a couple projects where there's literally a basketball hoop in somebody's apartment because they left that. And I don't think that was required by the Park Service, but you know, it was just kind of a neat little addition. So just because you have a common space doesn't mean you can't impact it in your development, but it's definitely something to be aware of. Again, additions, you know, should be non-intrusive and most importantly, distinct. So this is the other federal historic program. It's 10% of QRE. It's actually for buildings that are really not historic as deemed by the Park Service. The main threshold is it has to be built in 1936 or before. It's kind of a unfortunate aspect of the legislation. The legislation that enacted the historic tax credit as it exists was in 1986, and so they used 50 years as the threshold. They didn't index it, or whatever term you want to use. They didn't tie it to 50 years. They just left it at 1936, and so there's a push to change that, but it just hasn't happened yet. The only requirements are that you don't have to go through the Part 1, 2, and 3 application process. You do have to do a Part 1 to show that the building is not historic. And assuming that gets approved or denied or whatever, then you can do the 10% program, assuming you're not on the register. And so generally you have to preserve 50% of the external walls as external walls, 75% of external walls as either internal or external, so they have to be preserved either way, and then 75% of the internal structural framework. So not necessarily the partitions and all that kind of stuff, the non-structural, but the structural. So the Texas Historic Credit, as I already mentioned, is 25% of QRE. It mirrors the federal application process. So it's really not an additional piece of work you have to do. It's almost just you do have to submit a secondary form to the state, but it's almost, if you're applying for federal, it's almost a check the box kind of thing. So that's nice the way they've set it up, because not every state is like that. It offsets Texas franchise credits, Texas franchise tax, and it can also be accessed by tax-exempt entities. So the tax-exempt entity would get the credit and then sell it, and I'll go into that here in a second. So this is an explanation as to how you monetize both these credits. The federal credit is different than the state. So the federal credit, you do have to enter into a limited partnership with the tax credit investors. So they'll own 99% of your development entity. There's a couple structures, which I'll talk about in a second. You own 1% as the developer, and you maintain control through that 1%. The tax credit investor generally, they are an active partner in the deal, but generally what they care about is making sure the credits are going to be earned. And so they want to make sure you're complying with historic standards, you're meeting that substantial rehab test, and that you're going to get it placed in service. So those are their primary issues. Other than that, they kind of stay out of your way. There's a couple structures you can use. There's what they call single tier. So that's where the tax credit investor would become a 99% owner of either your fee simple owner entity, so the building, the entity that actually has the deed, or you can also, so we do this in a good bit of nonprofit tax exempt projects where we'll ground lease it. So we'll do a long-term lease. If a lease is longer than the depreciable life of the building, then it moves tax ownership down to the lessee. So that way, nonprofits can remain fee simple owner, or a for-profit developer. No reason they couldn't. In fact, we've done this on a couple projects in Montana, where they ground leased it. So that's an option if you want to use it. There's also a master tenant structure. Bottom line of this is some investors prefer it because it increases their return, so ultimately it increases the developer's return. So a tax exempt owner, as I've mentioned, can use these credits as long as the entity has not. So if they've owned and used the building prior to construction, then you have to look at whether they're going to occupy more than 50% of the space after construction exclusively. If they do, then you're not going to be able to use credits for that project. So if you have a building like in a city administration building, and it's city administration before and city administration after, you're not going to be able to use the federal credit. But if you have a situation where it may be, like I've heard it referred to as the sombrero building, so that would lend, even though it's owned by the city, that would lend itself to using tax credits, federal tax credits, because the users are not the city. It's leased out to third parties. So it's just an important thing to be aware of. For state credits, it's a much simpler process. It's, like I mentioned earlier, it's just a certificate that you sell, and these 4 steps just kind of outline what happens. We just went through this on Lane's project with the respective agencies. Something to be aware of is the proceeds of the Texas equity, the Texas Historic Tax Credit equity, are taxable. This is true in every state. There was a court case that delineated this, and so you may hear of pricing of 93 cents for every $1 of state historic tax credit you have, but that probably doesn't take into account the fact that when you get that 93 cents, so let's just say you have $1 million credit, you get $930,000 of tax credit equity, well, that's taxable. And so there's a 35% or whatever your federal tax rate is, chop off that. Some investors take that into account and will say, okay, we'll take 75% of your hit, but we're going to pay you 70 cents. So it's not as simple as people pay 90 cents and that's it. All right, so new market credits, unlike historic, they are competitive. So you actually have to, quote unquote, apply for allocation. Actually, technically what happens is CDEs, which are groups all around the country, so it's a pretty diverse group. You know, Habitat for Humanity has a CDE. There's a lot of for-profit groups. We have a CDE. Our firm does. You know, the Wall Street folks have CDEs. So it's a really diverse group. So a lot of cities have CDEs. So El Paso could apply for their own allocation. LA has an allocation. Danville, Virginia, of all places, got an allocation. And so what projects will do is approach those CDEs. So they commit to a certain kind of niche project. So they have a specific type of project they're looking for and a geography that they generally commit to. And so for projects in El Paso, obviously you want somebody who wants to do El Paso projects. And there are a number of CDEs that pursue Texas projects and specifically border projects. So El Paso is really, you know, an attractive location. Go ahead.
Would the CDE be set up a whole lot differently than a housing finance corporation, for instance?
Well, to set up a CDE is a pretty simple process, probably way simpler than a housing finance
If you have an
corporation.
existing HFC, which we do, could they also take on the CDE?
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, and it's really not.
That would give us, I'm VP of the HFC here, that would give us an additional pool of tax credits.
Exactly. Right, and you would pick, if you got new market allocation, so the Treasury awards, as is mentioned, the Treasury awards allocation to various groups around the country every year. Maybe 350 apply and probably about 100 get it. And so you would get, let's say, anywhere from $15 to $150 million of new market tax credit allocation. You would then pick the projects to which you're going to, distribute your allocation to. So absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, and I would recommend doing that. And there are groups out there. We don't really do this. We can connect you with some groups that write new market applications. It's a pretty extensive process. So if you're interested, I can connect you with some folks that do that. Yep.
So are they competitive because they're based on federal funding? And does this year's federal budget include?
It does. It does, yeah. And this year they've kind of done a unique thing where they've combined 2 years. So there's going to be, of late, there's been $3.5 billion of allocation available. This year there's going to be $7 billion because they're combining, I believe, this year and next year into a single allocation. And so groups have already applied and we're waiting to hear whether we're going to get allocation or not.
Do these have to be shovel ready, like the NSP programs and stuff?
Well, they don't necessarily have to be, no, when you apply. I mean, the more shovel ready they are, the more attractive they are to the CDFI fund. That's the division of the Treasury that reviews this. So the better the argument is for, hey, this project is ready to go as soon as we get new market allocation, the more attractive it's going to be in your application process. But it doesn't have to be necessarily.
Just one last quick question. Could you please comment on our market here in El Paso, how it fits in with the state, how it fits in nationally, how attractive is our building stock for these projects? How does this look to you and your firm? Give us an idea of what we have.
From my perspective, I think downtown El Paso is an extremely attractive location for new market allocation for two reasons. One is that your census tract, so to get in the door, to be eligible for new markets, you have to be in an eligible census tract. Your census tract is among the most distressed I've seen. It may be the most distressed. Well, the downtown. And specifically, I'm talking about the census tract that Lane Gaddy, the Martin Building, is in. It is among the most distressed I've seen. In addition to that, it's right on the border, and there's a lot of. And in addition to that, it's in Texas, which I believe I'm not sure if this year it is, but recent years it's been called an underserved state as designated by this program. So there's 7 or 8 of those every year. And so for those reasons, you are an extremely attractive location, El Paso specifically, and specifically the downtown location. So again, you can only get as much allocation as you have project costs. You realize a net benefit of about 15 to 20% of the allocation received. There is a natural floor to new market allocation that's higher than historic credits. If you don't spend about $5 million, it's pretty difficult to access this program. We've seen maybe $4 million. We've seen some really, really small projects, but that's only because a single CDE had a very specific goal of giving money to very small projects. We don't see that much, unfortunately, and that CDE has not gotten allocation again. And I don't really know why, because I thought it was a pretty, in terms of what the program is intended to do, I thought it was actually it did great because it was spreading its impact significantly. But for now, we're still looking at that $5 million floor. So this is just an explanation as to how you realize the benefit. So let's assume you get a new market allocation. Every dollar of this, just the way the program is written, every dollar of allocation you get generates a federal credit of 39 cents. And so again, in that $10 million example, you get $3.9 million of credits. An investor will come in and pay you. Right now, the market pricing is about 85 cents. So they'll pay you 85 cents for the $3.9 million of credits. So that leaves you with just north of $3 million of gross benefit. The CDE charges pretty significant fees. Generally it's at least, as much as or more than 10% of the allocation. So that's $1 million right off the top. And so you're left with, after attorneys and CDE fees and accountants, you're left with about 1.5 to maybe 2 million of benefit, 15 to 20% of the allocation you get. So this is just another program, renewable energy credits. If you want to integrate that, it's the same structure as historic credits. So it's something to think about if you want to, and you actually have to be generating electricity, not just doing energy efficiency improvements. So this is another program if you're willing to have rent and income limits that you can access. It's a very significant subsidy if you're willing to pursue it. It has some political ramifications in terms of cities may not want you to put low-income housing here and may want you to do it here, so it's just something to think of.
This El Paso History TV program is underwritten in part by the Hunt Family Foundation, an El Paso charitable trust that supports our local community.